everyone, welcome back to the channel. Now, have you ever had that feeling where you read your books or you watch a lecture video and you feel like you've learned something new, but then after a few days or weeks, the exam comes around and you try to recall that thing that you've just learned and you realize that you've forgotten everything that you thought you knew. And so in this video, I'll share 3 actionable tips to help you remember more of what you read, study, and learn so you forget less and do better on your exams. Let's get into it. Now, my whole life, from elementary, high school, college, or even all the way to med school, I was always taught what to study, but no one really taught me how. And whenever I asked someone like how to study or how to pass a subject or an exam, they would always just say, oh, just read this book or watch that lecture video. So I did that, but for some reason I was always a struggling student. Like in elementary and high school, like I consistently ranked near the bottom of my class, like maybe 37th out of a class of 40. But then when I got to nursing school, which was my pre-med, I started to get more interested in studying medical stuff, so I got pretty decent grades, but I was still doing what everyone else was doing, like highlighting almost every word in the book or taking down a lot of notes, and also always staying up late, like maybe just getting only 2 or 3 hours of sleep just to cram everything the night before the exam. But then when I got into med school, everything changed because now there was way more information to study, more things to memorize, and there were exams almost every week. And so even though I was spending a lot of time rereading or highlighting and staying up late, I still wasn't getting the scores that I even wanted, and in some exams I barely even passed. But then one summer between the first year and second year of med school, I had this thought in my head, like, is there a better way or a more efficient and more effective way to study? Because I knew that studying this way is definitely not going to be sustainable over the long run. And so I tried Googling a lot about how to study, and then I came across this book called Moonwalking with Einstein by Joshua Foer. And that's where I learned about something that's called as the memory palace or method of loci. And the idea is quite simple, actually, and that our memories evolve to remember visual and spatial information and not abstract facts. And that's why we tend to remember things we've seen before with our own eyes, or places that we know or we've been to, and that's why we really know them well. And so what you do is, instead of memorizing plain text, you transform that information into a vivid image, and then you place that image into a memory of a physical place or memory palace that you know very well, like you say your childhood home. Now let me give you an example. Now let's just say that I needed to memorize a grocery list: bread, eggs, butter, chicken, and milk. And so the next thing I do is I pick a place that I know very well. It can be our house, for example. So I imagine that our front gate is made out of that soft, fresh bread. And I also try to imagine the smell of it and how it feels on my hand, that warm, soft bread. And so on the way to the front door, I picture the ground covered in broken eggshells and like maybe some egg yolk. And it's messy and it smells bad, like rotten eggs. Now I'm standing in front of the door and the doorknob's all slippery from being covered in that butter. And then you can also smell that strong burnt butter smell in the air. And then after I walk through the door, I see our shoe rack. But instead of shoes, it's full of raw chicken. And the pieces, they still look like they're frozen, but they're starting to thaw. So the shoe rack is a bit wet from the melting chicken. The next thing I see is our dining table, and it's soaked in the spilled milk, and it's white and it's dripping down the floor. So when I get to the grocery store, and I wanted to remember that grocery list, I just take a tour around that memory palace that I have, starting at the front gate, and the images and the story that I've created in my head, they help me remember everything. Now, I know that that example is a bit more simple, but this is exactly how I use the memory palace or this method of loci to study and memorize everything in med school. And it actually worked for me because I could memorize a huge amount of information and I could still recall them even months or years later. And this was actually my secret, aside from the 2 other tips that I'll share in this video. But just because you're using this memory palace doesn't mean that you'll suddenly have a photographic memory or you'll remember 100% of what you've just studied, because our brains, it naturally forgets things. And to be honest, photographic memory isn't really a thing unless you're someone with a savant syndrome. But these techniques will make it less likely that you'll forget what you've studied. And for the stuff that you do forget, that's where another strategy comes in, which brings us to tip number 2, which is spacing out your studying. Now, back then, I used to cram like everyone else. I mean, because it just made more sense to me at the time. Like, why do I need to study weeks or months before the exam if I would just forget everything anyway, right? And that's what I believed. And honestly, that's what most of my friends believed as well. And that's exactly what I did. But I quickly realized that even just a few days after studying or after the exam, I would forget almost everything that I've studied. Like even the day after the exam, like most of it was already gone from my memory. And that's when I came across the idea of spaced repetition, and it completely changed the way I studied. So instead of waiting until a few days before the exam, I started studying the material much earlier, like weeks and sometimes even months before the exam. And then I would wait a few days or weeks before studying the same topic again. And obviously, by the time that I came back to the topic, I would already forgotten most of it, and I had to work really hard to remember that information. But actually, that effort of remembering is actually what helps make that memory more stable and easier to recall the next time. And also, a lot of students think that they're doing something wrong when studying feels hard, but the truth is that effortful recall of information that's been already forgotten is exactly what strengthens that memory. And that's why it's called spaced repetition, because you're intentionally creating that space in between each repetition of that same topic. And by creating that space, you allow some forgetting to happen, which then forces your brain to work harder to recall what you've already learned before. And that effort is what helps make that memory more stable and easier to recall the next time you need it. Now, this last tip is something that I've talked about a lot on this channel, mainly because I would say it's the one thing that really helped me pass all of my exams in med school and in residency as well, and even helps me get high scores in those exams, and that is active recall. Then the reason that it works is that the way the memory works is that we learn something by putting information into our brains whenever we read a book or watch a lecture video. But the thing is, that's passive. But the way we actually remember and actually learn new information is when we take that information out of our brains, and that part is active, which means it requires a lot of time and effort. And that's why it's called active recall. And to be honest, it's not always fun, especially when you realize that you've already forgotten a lot of the things that you thought you already knew before. That's why a lot of students avoid it, because it's not comfortable doing it. And most students, including myself, think that forgetting means that they're not smart or their memory's not good. But that's not true at all, because forgetting is completely normal. Like, it happens to me too, a lot. But I interrupt that forgetting by forcing myself to actively recall what I just studied. And even if it's hard, like, I always remind myself that it's that effort that makes that memory of that information stick. And actually, I made a separate video breaking down the step-by-step process that I've used for doing active recall whenever I'm studying for my exams, and I call it the fill the gaps framework. And if you want to check that out, I'll link that video somewhere up here. Alright, so we've basically talked about how to remember everything you read and how you can use it for your exams, and I definitely recommend giving it a try for your next exams. And if you're interested in more study techniques, then you might like to check out this video over here. It has 3 things that you can do to study much faster and more effectively. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in that video. Bye.